This is Palestine. This is Eretz Yisrael. This is our country. They come from Vilna and Warsaw, from Kiev and Odessa, from Budapest and Bucharest, from Paris and Berlin and Vienna. And all together, the countless thousands that are to come will go on to build and build new outposts of Jewish settlement, new cities and villages, to redeem the land from barrenness and waste, and to create a life of freedom and security for those who live and are to live in it.
This project started out to be a film about the one-state solution, to explain the facts on the ground, to show that the two-state solution and a viable Palestinian state is now practically an impossible achievement. But, as it turns out, this film would develop into something far different, something far more personal. This film is about 16 Israeli Jewish voices, 16 voices from the inside, from different generations, different backgrounds, and different perspectives.
I grew up in mandatory times under the British mandate, so it was before there was an independent state. And when the state was established in 1948, we were young and hopeful and very happy. My family felt that what one has to do is serve the country. There was a very close identity of what we were doing and what the country was doing. And that was it. Israel, this new country, this fantastic new country, is industry is developing, agriculture is developing, and lots of people are coming. And I must say, we were not fully aware of what happened in the War of Independence as far as the Arabs are concerned, the Palestinian Arabs who were thrown out or left and so on, and we were not very concerned about what's happening on the other side of the border. I'm talking about before 1967.
I grew up in England in London during the Blitz, and during the war, of course, we gradually learned about the Holocaust, the death, the killing of the Jews of Europe. And it was a very, very big influence on our growing up. And we were very under its shadow. And toward the end of the war, 45, 46, 47, 48, we began to hear about Israel and the idea of a new Jewish state. And we felt that, we had to be a bit of a phoenix and create something new from the ashes. And we believed that we could build a good state, a good society. In particular, those of us in the youth movement wanted to come to a kibbutz and live a communist life where everyone was equal. Everyone contributed according to their ability and received according to their needs. A kind of new way of life. We thought we'd build a model country which would be a good example to the world and also would reconstitute Jewish identity after the horrible slaughter of the war years and the Holocaust. We Zionists were a bit myopic. Jews were a people without a land, and we said a people without a land is coming to a land without a people. Of course, there was a people here, and this was nonsense. But it took some of us a bit of time to realize this.
We did not see from many years that we are becoming an ugly occupying power. I didn't see it, my husband didn't see it, and most of my friends around me didn't see it. And I personally began to have cracks in my rosy view of Israel, definitely in the Lebanon war. We found that an impossible, ugly war of conquering, cruel war, Beirut, cruel.
I then, for the first time, appreciated the Palestinian dimension, that there was a kind of national, cultural, religious, perhaps, problem.
I was very well aware of how ugly the occupation is, very. And I was very upset to what the occupation is doing to my country. And my youngest son did the reserve duty in Gaza and Nablus during the first Intifada, and he used to come back and tell me horrid stories. That was the beginning of uncovering all the
I'm an Israeli citizen. I'm a native of this country. Actually, I was born here in '46. That was before the state. My great-grandparents came here in the end of the 19th century from Russia, and there was nothing. And they farmed. They made new Jews. So, you know, that kind of nostalgia to, oh, let's go back to who we were. I don't know. I've been reading up about '48. I've been reading up about what happened to the new immigrants that came here in the early '50s. I remember them from next door. You know, they weren't having such a great time. When I hear people who get upset and very nostalgic to a kind of little brave, modest, moral, Spartan Israel of the 50s and 60s, let's say, and they're harking back to that, I'm not a part of that nostalgia, because today I know how much of this was part of this make-believe. Heile Welt, how do you say Heile Welt in English? This kind of perfect, this little perfect make-believe world.
I've lived in Israel now for 30 years. I come originally from the States. I came in 1973 to live in Israel.
You know, 70% of the Jews in the United States have no affiliation with the organized Jewish community. So the voices of the organized Jewish community that do support Israel only represent a minority of the Jews, and a lot of that minority is in New York City or Miami. You know, Hillel and Hadassah and the American Jewish Congress, and B'nai B'rith and Zionist organizations, the federations that really don't speak for the Jewish community but have arrogated to themselves that kind of a voice. And the Jews abroad are ethnic. They want to be a part of the societies that they're living in, but they also want to keep something Jewish. So for them, Israel becomes a linchpin of their identity. In other words, as long as they have an Israel that they can galvanize around, a threatened, beleaguered little Israel, and a very idealized Israel, an Israel of Golda Meir, of the kibbutz, of Leon Uris and Exodus. In other words, an Israel that in many ways hasn't existed for 50 years, if it ever existed. If they can organize themselves around that, have their kids come on a birthright program to Israel, have meetings in the Federation to raise millions of dollars to support Israel, that in a sense gives them that center that keeps the community together. Because without Israel, who are the Jews? The Jews are a middle-class white population. They're sort of saying, we don't want to hear this stuff. We don't want to deal with this. leave us alone. Leave us with our Leon Uris, Golda Meir Israel. In other words, talking about Israel, the real Israel, in a very critical way, is very threatening to them. It's only in terms of Israel that people somehow feel that any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism or questioning the right to exist of the state of Israel. And that's what raises that ante so high, that you can't talk about those real things.
I was raised in the United States with the Zionist Education. My mother tongue actually is Hebrew. My parents wanted us to be speaking Hebrew and be familiar with the sources, and I had a Bible lesson with my dad in the morning before I went up to school. I entered the National Jewish Bible Contest. I actually won the contest in 1967, and the first prize was a trip to Israel. I came to Israel for a year, studied in a yeshiva, and one thing led to another, and I ended up staying. To most Jews in the world today, there's a theology of the state of Israel, the idea that this is, essential and in some way willed by God and a way of worshiping God. And they've sold this to the larger organized Christian world, the idea that respecting Judaism means supporting the state of Israel as a Jewish state. So that I think it's very important that people who are interested in the meaningful relationship with Jews and Judaism recognize that is not a necessary prerequisite to being involved in dialogue and understanding coexistence with Jews. I think that many of the foundational myths of Israeli society are cracked now, and this is not only in terms of the righteousness of our cause, and it's not black and white. The sacred cows have been slaughtered to a large extent.
Israel's a real place. It's a real country. It's got real problems. The problems between Ashkenazi Jews and Oriental Jews, between the social classes, between the religious and the secular. Problems of more and more violence in Israeli society. Of immigration, Russian immigrants, only 2/3 of whom are Jewish, integrating into the society. Israel becoming a pluralistic society. The fact that Israel defines itself as a Jewish democracy, but only 70% of the population is Jewish, and it creates racist tendencies within the society.
The fantasy or the desire of Jews to be living in a majority. I remember living that. I came from life as a minority in America. I came to live here in a majority among Jews in Israel, and at first I thought that was wonderful, and now I recognize how corrupting and how problematic that is. Understandable, but still not acceptable.
I grew up in California in a Zionist youth movement. And so from an early age learned about Israel. I think it's a fantasy of Israel. It's a very idealized sort of presentation, of course, because the whole point is to forge a connection between Americans from the United States and Israel, with this ideology that Jews belong here, that we are responsible for Israel and vice versa. So it was only in college that I came for a semester program that I saw a more complex picture both about Israeli society, about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, about the reality of the occupation. And for me it was a shock. I thought I knew Israel quite well.
I come from a very right-wing family. Until about 20 years ago, I was never involved in anything. I was even very right-inclined politically. For many years, I was very concerned about not meeting any Arabs whatsoever. We're completely disconnected societies. And one day in a parents-teachers meeting, I spoke about it with a woman, and she said that there's a group of Jews and Arabs, Israelis, all of them, who meet every month. I came and
I started meeting and talking with Arabs, and my whole world has actually changed, because I was brought up to believe that a good Arab is a dead Arab. All the truths that I was raised on, all my education, it just fell to pieces.
I grew up in this sort of lefty house, for example, but still I have never had any direct contact with Palestinian citizens within Israel. In my hometown, we live like 5 minutes from a nearby Palestinian city. We used to play, in the ruins of their village nearby, and I never even thought it was like something ruins from an ancient period. We never even thought about it.
I'm an Israeli Just Peace activist, and I live in Ramallah. I grew up mostly in Israel, mostly in Tel Aviv, even though I lived for 5 years in Canada when I was a child. And basically until I was 15, I didn't know that there was an occupation. I was taught, Jewish history, history of dispossession, oppression, ethnic cleansing, obviously culminating in the Holocaust. The Arabs didn't really fit into it. There's a very big taboo considering the ethnic cleansing that took place in 1948 and the forced expulsions and the massacres. But when I was born in 1971 and was growing up, it was a non-issue. It wasn't in the news. And when the occupied territories were referred to, they were referred to as Judea and Samaria and Gaza. The first time I heard about the occupation, we went on some school, out of school, enrichment day. And it was very enriching. It was the first time in my life I was hearing about people who didn't have rights, who didn't have political rights, who were forbidden to gather, who could be arrested without charge and held, who were being tortured. I couldn't believe that she was talking about Israel. I was totally against what I had been taught about us, our enlightened, nature, because we are conditioned as Israelis and taught by our parents, by the media, by the school, that we are morally superior to the Arabs. That talk, it totally broke my paradigm of the world, because I recognized the oppression that she was talking about from the Jewish history that I was taught. But all of a sudden, we were on the wrong side of the equation. All of a sudden, it was the Jews that were doing this. I couldn't justify it in any way. It didn't matter, the stories that I had been told about the Arabs.
"75% of the indigenous Palestinian population, approximately 800,000 people, were expelled before, during, or immediately after Israel's 1948 war.
I was a soldier in 1948, and I just know what we did in that war and how the refugee problem was created. I think we must recognize our responsibility for creating that part of this problem which we did create.
Palestinians represent the longest suffering and largest refugee population globally, 1/4 of all refugees in the world. Today, they number over 6.5 million people. But those who remained inside Israel are second-class citizens.
We are occupiers more than 30 years. The people are really oppressed. They are second-rate human beings. We took their land. Every town and every village became a kind of detention camp. They cannot go from one place to the other. We destroyed their infrastructure in order to build more and more Jewish settlements, because the fanatics, religious fanatics, believe that the land is there. You cannot speak of Jewish values, you cannot speak of democracy, and at the same time to rule over other people and to take their land and to destroy their agriculture completely.
Under the pretext of redeeming the land, since 1967, Israel's military and settlers have destroyed more than 1 million fruit-producing olive trees cultivated by Palestinian farmers. Some trees are as old as 1,000 years. In 1967, Israel confiscated all Palestinian water sources. By law today, Palestinians are barred from even collecting the rainwater falling from the sky. Widely practiced by Israel, administrative detention means imprisonment without justification or actual cause. Today, hundreds of Palestinians are held indefinitely without charge because no crime has occurred.
I think that as a policy, a country can't go on having an immoral policy. You know, it's impossible. I don't know how it's lasted so long, 38 years.
The UN Convention of the Child states that no child should undergo cruel, degrading punishment or torture. Since 1999 in Israel, over 4,000 Palestinian children, deprived of a lawyer, have been imprisoned and interrogated.
I can tell you personally that I'm especially averse to the degree of lying or deceit that was needed to weave the kind of moral tapestry that I grew up on personally.
Since 1967, in an attempt to intimidate the civilian population, Israel has detained and imprisoned over 650,000 Palestinians.
Morally, I am very unhappy with what we are doing. And when the Jewish people over the world are talking about the Jewish values, yes, they are written in the book, but we don't act according to it, unfortunately.
In the hope that Israeli Jews will recognize how un-Jewish the situation is, that it's created a Jew which is unrecognizable in terms of the moral qualities and values that have been Jewish values.
I come from a religious family, and I remember my grandparents who were very religious Jews, and they were spiritual people. There was nothing aggressive in them. There was something powerful, but from the inside. What has happened today to Judaism is that it became a militaristic, nationalist thing that puts stones and territories before worship and moral values and high spiritual values. I don't recognize this Judaism anymore.
After David was killed, I used to have a PR office, and I really didn't know what I wanted to do with my life because your whole sense of priorities changes. Would it not be worthwhile to do anything if you could prevent this happening to another family? There's no revenge for a lost child. There isn't.
My life is more or less as long, it's parallel to the life of this of the sovereign state of Israel. And I grew up on all the myths and realities that made up its young history. And army was a very organic part of that. Militarization here has used Jewish just fears, or the history of Jewish just fear, to build up this incredible inner fortification against any kind of just peace.
I grew up in an Israeli educational system, which is not much of a bargain. I did develop some kind of an attitude of repulsion toward things that I felt that are being brainwashed into me in the system. The military is present all the time. You have weaponry all around. You have soldiers all around. You know, they advertise white cheese by referring to the army, or cell phones. There are also special curricula in school for preparation to military service, so-called. The official guide contains some really nasty materials. The military service is sold to children as some kind of a summer camp, and to parents often. Like, oh, go to the military, have some fun, kick some Arab ass, hey!
In Israel, your military service is something that you're raised on. You breastfeed it. It's the oxygen that you breathe. You can't pinpoint it. It's at school, it's at home, it's on TV, it's the terminology that we use, it's how we reflect on ourselves. And when you learn your own history in most of the schools, there are almost no Arabs. It's about you, it's about the Zionist movement.
I served as a first sergeant in combat unit in Achal Brigade, 15th Battalion. I joined IDF at March 2001. I was discharged in March 2004. I was trained on a grenade machine gun. I was there with my grenade machine guns, snipers with their rifles. And we used to return fire inside the city every night. When you fire a machine gun, there's no way to really aim exactly towards your target. My battalion commander just screamed from the radio, "Fire, fire," and ran to the machine gun, loaded, and started shooting all over the neighborhood. And we call it frightened fire. We had to fire the Palestinians back, that they should be afraid. We have to respond, we have to show them who rules the place, who controls the city. And that's what we did every night.